Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. He was the master builder, the power broker, who went to Yale and Oxford. She was a housewife, devoted mother of three, from Scranton, PA, with a high school diploma. He rode in a limo, she a bicycle with a basket in front. They were opposites who redefined the American city. He Goliath, she David. He was Robert Moses, she was Jane Jacobs. Here to tell us about the epic battle between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs and their meaning today is Anthony Flint, the author of Wrestling with Moses, How Jane Jacobs Took on New York's Master Builder and Transformed the American City. Mr. Flint is the Director of Public Affairs at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, a Cambridge, Mass. think tank where he writes about urbanism and development. He has been a reporter and columnist for the Boston Globe, a visiting scholar at the Harvard Design School, and a policy advisor to Massachusetts state government, among other accomplishments. Welcome, Anthony.
It's great to be here.
Congratulations. This is a great book, great reviews, and a story that wasn't told either in Robert Caro's The Power Broker or in Death and Life of American Cities. So we've got this story here. Now, Jane Jacobs, the winner?
Well, I think ultimately, yes. She comes to New York in 1934, falls in love with the city, sets out to be a journalist, actually, but ends up being a community activist because there at her home at 555 Hudson Street in Greenwich Village, she encounters these proposals by Robert Moses that were part and parcel of the era of urban renewal, where the bulldozers came in and got rid of the old neighborhoods, and we built highways through cities. But in that process, you know, she also wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which revolutionized the field of planning and urban planning and how we view cities and city building today. And you fast forward to today, some 40, 50 years later, and her principles and what she wrote about in Death and Life really uniformly embraced by the planning and design professions. So in that sense, I think her legacy is really the more powerful one.
So with Death and Life, you really do have a paradigm shift. I mean, she's attacking not only the building by Robert Moses and his plans, but really the whole modernist paradigm of what a city should be like. And as you note in the book, her book is part of a great number of books. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, Michael Harrington's Other America, Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, that really were seminal and revolutionary. You get this revolutionary time here.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. I mean, Bob Dylan has just come to town.
Right.
His music is in the streets. Times are changing, but really they were all pioneers. But in the field of urban planning, Jane Jacobs certainly a path-breaking, and really came up and stood up and challenged the establishment. And the establishment took the form of master builders like Robert Moses, but also, as you mentioned, modernism, the principles and theories of guys like Corbusier, who gave us the towers in the park, and the mandarins of the architecture schools at the time. It was a lot to take on, and here she was, an uncredentialed housewife, and she stood up and challenged the establishment in this way.
What, according to Jacobs, made for successful neighborhoods? What was the revolution? What was this paradigm shift?
Well, I think first and foremost, she saw that the planners were sitting at their drafting tables and creating these towers in these barren plazas, and they weren't following up to see whether it worked or not. And so that was really, I think, what outraged her in a way. And then she went and looked around and saw that there were places that actually did work, and these were the existing neighborhoods like Greenwich Village. So what were the secrets to the success? The ingredients included shorter street blocks, more of a human scale rather than big facades and towers, functional open space with activity and benches and walkways arranged in such a way that really engaged our more human side and our sense of community. Diversity of uses, mix of uses, very important. She believed that these neighborhoods really kind of emerged organically and couldn't be planned or built.
Okay. But at the same time, Robert Moses, in a sense the villain of many of the pieces, you came in from Boston today, and on your road into the studio, you traveled on the infrastructure that Robert Moses built. In the book, you catalog it. 13 bridges, 2 tunnels, 637 miles of highway, 658 playgrounds, 10 giant swimming pools, 17 state parks, and dozens of newer renovated city parks. Jones Beach, the UN, Lincoln Center, Central Park Zoo, and on and on and on. Is today's city of New York as much Moses' city as Jacobs? Or is this a unique combination of both?
Well, it absolutely is the city that Moses built. I mean, he's responsible for all that infrastructure and more. The parks we enjoy today, Central Park Zoo, the list really does go on and on. And today, if you fast forward, his appreciation for the importance of infrastructure has become terribly important. If you look at the Second Avenue subway or other large projects, here is a man who had vision and understood that infrastructure was as much an important part of the city as those human-scale neighborhoods that Jane Jacobs was defending. I think what happened is that he just took things too far. He got carried away, if you will. But a lot of the infrastructure that he put in place, terribly important for New York's economic competitiveness.
And Moses, in many ways, is a classic progressive. In some ways, Jacobs and Moses' goal were quite similar, to build housing for the people. Their means were very different, and sometimes their ends resulted in different ends. But the book points out the similarity in many ways of their goals.
Yes, absolutely, and that is to increase the supply of housing. You needed housing for low and moderate income families. The difference was one of scale and design, so that Moses believed for many years in the towers in the park, whereas Jacobs tried to introduced greater density into her neighborhood in a different way. She's responsible in part for the West Village houses, of course, a terrific series of 5-story red brick buildings. And she believed that if you built enough of those kinds of projects and sort of sprinkled them around the city, then they would serve as windbreaks or they would serve as little islands of affordability. And the most important thing, though, was to increase the supply of housing, increase the supply of these great neighborhoods. Then they wouldn't be so scarce, then they wouldn't be so pricey. That was her approach.
You point out that in a sense, the central dilemma of Jacobs's work is gentrification, and talk about that as both the central dilemma in her work as well as an important dilemma for the American city.
Yeah, you know, that's one of the things about this book. It's really been wonderful because a lot of these issues are quite relevant today. Right. You go down to the meatpacking district and the West Village today in Soho, and it's pretty rarefied. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, but yes, I think that gentrification is really the biggest challenge facing revitalizing cities today. In New York, San Francisco, Boston, Washington. Now, there are things you can do. You can have inclusionary zoning, community land trusts. You can have policy interventions to try to bring about more affordability. But Jacobs never really solved this question of what she called it over-success, which I think is a pretty good term. And in New York, certainly in Manhattan, you see this in spades. Now, she said that other neighborhoods should improve and just continue to improve. So, for example, Hoboken or Newark, you know, would be sort of the next big neighborhood. But that is in itself a process of gentrification. So, you know, where does it end? It's a tough, really tough challenge.
The paradox here, though, is that as you succeed in making the environment Jane Jacobs' neighborhood, it attracts people into it, it attracts money, and it drives out the the baker, the butcher, the key maker, etc. So the very people that she cites in Death and Life, they don't live there anymore. In fact, as you pointed out, her townhouse is up for sale at 555 Hudson. For how much money?
I believe $3.7 million for that building.
So there's a hole in the theory, or there's a hole in the practice, or there's a hole in both?
Well, it's a complex issue, and by the way, the Jacobses paid $7,000 for that building in 1947, so it was a pretty good investment.
Nice.
Her argument was always that if you just increase supply, there would be more of these kinds of wonderful neighborhoods, and things would even out. The experience of cities has been very difficult, of course, recently with the economic downturn. It's been a pause in many ways to sort of reassess how we go about our city building and our development. But you know, cities are wonderful places. It's no surprise really that they would be popular with everyone from celebrities to you know, to wealthy families. And the trick is to make them economically diverse and well-functioning, truly sustainable communities. And it's a hard challenge.
You begin the book with Jane Jacobs getting arrested. And one of the things about Jacobs is her neighborhood activism. Talk about her as a political strategist and tactician.
Well, the funny thing is, you know, she never really enjoyed being an activist. She always said she would much rather be just working on her books and doing her research and writing. But she was a pretty good one.
She's good.
She was sort of like Karl Rove, you know, 40, 50 years ago. She knew the value of a good photo op. My favorite one is at Washington Square Park, where they do the ribbon tying instead of the ribbon cutting for a big public works project. And she understood the value of sort of trotting her children out there.
Absolutely.
And she also made friends in the media, including at the Village Voice, which was just beginning in the 50s. And she also was very good tactician in terms of bringing in up-and-coming politicians of the time, Ed Koch, John Lindsay, many others, and attracted them to her cause. The rebellion against urban renewal, the roadway through Washington Square Park, Lower Manhattan Expressway, and these politicians saw the value in associating themselves with these citizen efforts. But there she was at the Lion's Head Cafe, you know, in the West Village, rallying the troops, inspiring others, really making people believe that you could fight City Hall.
Talk about the arrest and sort of the context, because one of the beauties of the book is the retelling of the battles in very personal terms, even though they have larger significance. Why was she arrested?
Well, this is in April of 1968. It's a very tense time in the city and the country. And there was a hearing on the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which was a project that just wouldn't die. She had been fighting it for 8+ years.
Talk about the proposal.
The Lower Manhattan Expressway was proposed by Robert Moses as a 10-lane elevated highway that would have run down Broome Street, connecting the Holland Tunnel with the Williamsburg and Manhattan bridges. And this was one of a number of crosstown expressways that Moses wanted to build. Of course, the one he built was the Cross Bronx Expressway. But just think of it, you know, 10 lanes elevated down Broome Street, and all those beautiful cast iron facade buildings would have been destroyed. So the fight was against that, and it was quite a colorful fight, as I write about in the book. She enlisted a soft-spoken minister, some shadowy figures from Little Italy, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I do.
Politicians from the left and the right. But by 1968, the project still wouldn't go away. So at a Seward...
it was like Lazarus. It was killed,
yes,
it rose.
Yeah.
It was killed, it rose.
And this was all sort of, at the same time, there was a lot of concern about the economic strength and vitality of Lower Manhattan. And ultimately, this is what gave us the World Trade Center.
Right.
But many people thought that the Lower Manhattan Expressway would be an integral part of that revitalization. So in April of '68, there she was at the Seward Park High School, and she got up, and the crowd was chanting for her, And she said, we're going to make a little protest march here. And of course, all the officials there said, no, 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 please don't do that. And it ended up getting pretty raucous. The record on the stenotype was torn up and thrown into the air like confetti. And then a police officer tapped her on the shoulder and said, Miss Jacobs, you'll have to come with me. She ends up in the back of a squad car. And initially it was disorderly conduct, but then she got charged with inciting a riot. And so she felt like she was being targeted, and that this was a way of scaring people for protesting in this way. It was a pretty dramatic moment in her fight against these Moses projects.
Now, this Lower Manhattan Expressway, as you point out, wasn't the only cross-Manhattan expressway that Robert Moses wanted to build. He wanted to build one right outside here on 34th Street,
yes,
right across town, and also one at 125th Street.
Yeah.
What would the city have been like had he been successful?
Well, you know, again, you look at the Triborough Bridge, you look at the Henry Hudson, and some of the infrastructure you can't imagine the city without.
Right.
But in terms of these crosstown expressways, again, I think he really just took things too far, and I think that Manhattan would be a very different place. And if you believe that the Cross Bronx Expressway had a negative impact on those neighborhoods, then surely a Lower Manhattan Expressway and a Mid Manhattan Expressway and an Upper Manhattan Expressway would have turned the city into something very different. Moses believed that the city was created by and for traffic. And at the time, with all the emphasis on the car, that was just what you did.
Mm-hmm.
You tried to make it easy to come in from the suburbs and park and so forth.
The Lower Manhattan Expressway was the second of two great fights that Jacobs had with Moses. The first one was the fight over his proposal to run Fifth Avenue right through Washington Square Park. Talk about that and its significance.
It was all rolled up in Moses's urban renewal plans at the time. This was the beginning in the 40s, but really the action took place in the 50s. And he had just built Washington Square Southeast, which was classic towers in the park on what is now known as LaGuardia Place. Mm-hmm. What he wanted to do was extend Fifth Avenue so that LaGuardia Place would be Fifth Avenue, and give that development a Fifth Avenue
address, right?
But to do this, he had to run a 6-lane and then a 4-lane roadway right through Washington Square Park. This was the place that the people in the neighborhood brought their kids to play, and it was a crucial sort of 10-acre open space in the middle of all that pavement. Mm-hmm. You know, it was really cherished place and had a lot of history. And so Jane Jacobs initially was just a foot soldier in that fight, but then she took a more
her kids
active
played in the park.
Yes. So I guess the message there is, you know, don't mess with mothers. Yeah.
Well, and at one point in the book, you tell of Moses saying, sputtering, fulminating, that the only people who opposed this was a bunch of mothers.
Yes. How could this be?
Right.
Yes.
So the mothers won. And then after that, after the Washington Square Park and the Lower Manhattan Expressway fights, then there's the West Village urban renewal. And as you tell it, and as I've heard it told, this was almost a shot at Jane Jacobs by Robert Moses.
Well, that's some of what I hint at in the book. He had handed over the housing portfolio largely by that point, around about 1960. So he moved on from being Parks Commissioner and a number of other posts, but he was very much behind the scenes. By the way, he concentrated on the World's Fair at that point, the World's Fair of 1964, right. And then also
I'm a Queens kid.
Building highways. So he had technically moved on, but his presence was very much still in the picture, and he was behind the scenes. Other figures, such as James Felt and others, kind of took over. But this was the same policy of urban renewal, where you bulldoze the old and start anew. But imagine you're Jane Jacobs, you've just finished the manuscript for Death and Life of Great American Cities, and you read in the newspaper that 14 blocks, including the very block that you described, the sidewalk ballet,
right.
was going to be bulldozed and designated as a slum. So that's what she rose up and fought against.
And she wins all of these battles.
It involves going to a lot of planning commission hearings. She has a mole in City Hall that tips her off very importantly to
they're
certain
spying,
things.
and they notice that they got memoranda from developers with the same crooked letter
that's right.
on the
She does a little
typewriter.
detective work.
There's a lot of, that kind of thing in here. But at the same time that they are these very different people with very different personalities and very different ideas, they're similar, despite the differences in background, outlook, and impact. What are those similarities?
Well, they both wrote poetry, for example. They're both obviously hard-charging individuals, and they both actually wanted to improve cities. Now, Moses very often gets a bad rap for wanting to destroy, or somehow responsible for destroying.
Well, I mean, I think it's essentially the thesis of Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker.
But every step of the way, there were other issues involved in terms of him amassing power and so forth, but every step of the way, I think he was out to save New York City and improve its economic development and to provide housing. Jane Jacobs clearly was a lover of cities, and that comes through very clearly in writing Death and Life and trying to guide planners and developers to go about this in a more sensitive way, to really appreciate what makes a well-functioning urban neighborhood and a sense of community. And so I think they're similar in that way, but Jane Jacobs pulls ahead a little bit in terms of what makes a good neighborhood work.
One thing that struck me was if their ages and historical moments had been reversed, what would New York City be like today without the Robert Moses?
Well, it's a fascinating thing to consider. In the U.S. today, you have cities like Baltimore or Detroit, that are not making it, and then you have cities like New York and Boston and San Francisco that are really grappling with this over success. And so New York may have become a bit more like Baltimore without Robert Moses. And I think that's an important lesson for today, because I think there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to a lot of big projects, and there are a lot of important issues involved in things like Atlantic Yards or Coney Island rezoning. But cities need vision and big projects sometimes, and infrastructure to be successful.
And in a sense, could we use a Moses today?
Well, I think we could use someone who could spend the stimulus money wisely, for example, not on highways and bridges to nowhere, but on transit and on inner-city rail. High-speed rail, I think, is a critically important infrastructure now that we as a nation really need. It would be great to have someone with the vision and the know-how and the savvy and the ability to sort of navigate the bureaucracy to get things done, like high-speed rail.
Any contenders?
Well, I would say that we have our first urban president in a long time, so let's start with President Obama. I'm not suggesting that he could be the new Robert Moses, but he does appreciate the importance of infrastructure and things like high-speed rail, inner-city rail. Robert Yarrow, right here in New York with the Regional Plan Association, has, I think, the kind of long-range vision for the city's future and what it takes to be a 21st century city. So figures like that, thinking about regional planning and metropolitan regions and their critical importance in our economy. I think cities are going to be hubs of innovation in this new green economy, and so there's a lot of promise for cities. So many of our mayors, I guess I would include Mayor Bloomberg, and governors that are looking at sustainability and energy and climate change, they're all looking to cities as the future.
Looking at, and you briefly allude to it, I believe, in the book or in one of the other things that you've done, Plan NYC, the sustainability program of Mayor Bloomberg. likely to happen, important, good?
I think it's a solid master plan for sustainability. They hit all the elements. And, you know, a lot of it isn't terribly glamorous. Like, for example, there's this proposal to retrofit almost 1 million existing buildings, you know, the big apartment buildings on Park Avenue and elsewhere. And that means going in and giving them new furnaces and windows and making them energy efficient. Now, it's not as showy as a new green building, for example, but this is really important work. Because if you can make those buildings energy efficient, and it's right around the corner from a subway station, you're talking about the greenest form of human settlement that we could possibly aspire to.
Is that the future of American urban planning?
I think it's very much wrapped up in these notions of sustainability, being energy conscious, and most important, being conscious of climate change and reducing emissions by living in places that have density and transit and a mix of uses in places where you can walk or ride a bike. That's cities.
Their impact isn't only American, it's international. As I told you, I visited Shanghai in 2007. It's like Moses on steroids. But in Mumbai, they're talking about land use control. So their battle wasn't only a battle in one point in historical time, or even uniquely American, but we're really talking about an international phenomenon.
It's happening again and again. It's playing out again and again today. And again, you know, that's really been rewarding about research and writing this book, is that there's a lot of relevance today. Shanghai, perfect example. The city building that is going on there is amazing, but there's also some suburban highway car-dependent urbanization that's going on in China right now that is not very green. So that's important to keep an eye on. And there's the notion basically of urban renewal going on in the slums of Mumbai. You know, after Slumdog Millionaire came out, a lot of discussion of, well, now wait a second, is there something that actually functions well about this kind of informal settlement? So you see these discussions and debates sort of playing out over and over.
My thanks to Anthony Flint, author of Wrestling with Moses, How Jane Jacobs Took on New York's Master Builder and Transformed the American City. My guest next week is President and CEO of TIAA-CREF, Roger Ferguson, Jr. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.